responsible for these bombings. Now, joining us at the table is our friend Tim Clemente. He's a former FBI counterterrorism investigator and special agent. And Tim has handled counterterrorism planning for sporting, entertainment, and political events, as well as counterterror investigator. He has worked on numerous bombings. So can we start with this? We have Russian security forces saying they have a suspect in one of these bombings. So let's start with this. Who is it responsible? Should we focus on these Chechen Islamic extremist groups?
Obviously, the Chechens are a big problem, especially for the Russians. So, and the problem is going to be individuals. They're not going to be looking at large group tactics in something like this. If they're going to attack the Olympics is a hard target. No matter where it is, it's a hard target. But there's a lot of soft targets associated with that. The venues where the athletes stay. I mean, look back to Munich in '72, where the athletes were attacked in their residence. The problem with something as huge as a Winter Olympics, it's not in one small venue. It's not contained in one stadium. It controls a massive area that they have to try and keep secure.
Well, let me do this. I want to put up a map that shows where I just showed you two suicide bombings. Volgograd. It's a little over 400 miles away from Sochi, and what you can see there, and they're both, by the way, not too far from the Caucasus region where Chechnya and Dagestan are. In fact, Sochi is much closer to that area than Volgograd. Why would, no matter who this is, Islamic extremists, Chechen separatists, why would they execute terrorist plots weeks before the Olympics? Why wouldn't they keep this powder dry and have the impact during the Olympics?
Because the impact is almost greater doing this in advance. Doing this in advance, you now have them totally antsy. The whole world is coming down on the Russians saying, you better be secure, you better be secure. And the harder they harden that target, the more vulnerable they are other places. They only have a certain number of resources they can use wherever they are. And if they're bringing the military in, they're bringing special forces, they're bringing their intelligence assets to bear to protect the Olympics, the rest of the country is virtually vulnerable.
Tim, does strongman Putin have advantages that democratic and open America may not in his ability to crack down on these types?
Obviously. I mean, I don't think Putin's going to be at all afraid to crack down very, very hard, especially in the Caucasus region. If that's where he thinks this threat is coming from, I don't think he'll have any problem going there.
He's already, by the way, arrested 700 people in the wake of these bombings, so he's began to act on it.
That hammer is going to come down hard.
He's just picking them up. One of the things I thought was interesting, Tim, and I talked to some U.S. officials about this that are looking at that region in particular, but if you look at Dagestan, you look at the Boston Marathon bombers. I mean, he visited Dagestan, spent about 6 months, they believe, in that region, you know, training with these guys. So how realistic is it that, you know, that we're not looking at the Chechenian threat here as well and in other parts of Europe? I mean, this is not just endemic to there. I mean, the first threat that came to Sochi came from Syria, from a group in Syria that actually said, we will attack. They were Chechens fighting in Syria on July 30th. We will attack Sochi. So what's your estimation of, like, should we remain vigilant? I mean, is this something that can happen here?
I think the problem is it has happened here. Obviously, we look at the Boston Marathon bombing as a perfect example. It's an example of two things. Not only the threat from, you know, wild card individuals that are going off as lone gunmen, bombers in this case, where they weren't suicide bombers. Those guys were gunmen. They wanted to actually get in gun battles after the fact. The bombings were just the start. And so the problem is that in the Caucasus region, these are Slavs that look like every other Russian, look like everybody else from that region. These aren't the Middle Easterners that try and coming into the United States on 9/11. So they blend very well. They're going to blend in wherever they are, in most of the Western world.
And that's where I think doing this now with the time between the Olympics and now is more effective for them, because they know that that's something that America's watching, that we're worried about because of the Boston bombings, and so is now Russia, and they have weeks of this buildup of where the attention is on them, where they are effectively being very effective at just terrorizing people.
What is the degree of international involvement in terms of trying to root this out? Like, how much are American security forces able to be involved in at least some of the early prevention or protecting American athletes while they're over there?
Well, with the Olympics, there's a great deal of involvement. There has to be, because the International Olympic Committee is the overall responsible party for the security of the Olympics. So there's going to be Americans working with the Russians, working with European forces to figure out security. We obviously would be responsible for our own athletes, so we'll have special operators there from the special mission units within the military and other agencies. FBI is heavily involved in it, as the CIA is. And so we'll work with the Russian forces. So something like this is actually really good, that it happens in advance and forces them to work much harder.
So just to be clear, Tim, we'll send over FBI forces, CIA forces, and military forces to patrol and protect essentially our athletes during these Olympics?
But what's the tactic to protect the soft targets that you talked about? Because the 1996 bombings, which I lived in Atlanta at that time, that was completely a soft target removed from the actual stadium.
Well,
so how
I
are
think
they
you're going to see
that area?
the way we do it in the United States is we would call it a National Special Security Event, NSSE. And the Secret Service takes precedence on the actual security planning for something like that. The FBI takes precedence for counterterrorism planning, crisis and consequence management. So something like the Olympics, where you're spread out in multiple venues, you have to create an outer perimeter, and that outer perimeter is very hard to do in a large area. So I think you're going to see roadblocks all over that area of Russia.
But this has got to be run by the Russian security forces.
That has to be run by the Russian, but I'm saying that's the outer perimeter.
Okay.
The Russians would handle the outer perimeter. Then each of the local, or the teams in their localities, wherever they're staged, where their housing is, they're going to have their own security from their own nation, and then local authorities will also be there. So there's going to be multiple layers. This is going to be a very, very slow-moving city when those Olympics start taking place.
Wow, yeah, I bet. What about for tourists, people that are going from the United States to Russia? They may not be staying in Sochi. They may be going to Moscow. They may be traveling in other areas like Volgograd. Do you think that they need to take more precaution?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
What be aware of your surroundings. Always be aware of where you are and what's happening around. You look for, you hear this in New York City all the time for years, the transit authority talking about if you see something, say something. Well, the fact that you're in a foreign country that is a huge target right now for terrorism, you have to be very, very aware of where you are and be aware of who you're with, and don't make yourself ignorant. And by that I don't mean stupid, I mean literally ignorant of the culture and what's going on around you. Have somebody that knows the local culture be with you if possible. Know the language if you're going to be in an area where you're a foreigner.
Tim, obviously this is a high-profile location, time. It could be perceived as a tipping point in one direction or another. Is how much of a grip does Putin have on Chechen and those separatists? Mm-hmm. Do you see that the crackdown, you mentioned 700 people have already been arrested. Do you anticipate that Putin will use this as an opportunity to go further and deeper into those separatist movements and strengthen his control of that region, which really has emanated to Boston and elsewhere? Do you see this as, even beyond the Olympics, something he will take?
What was his exact quote this week? He's going to come down like a sledgehammer on them, or annihilate them? I mean, I think that's clear indication that he does.
It's weird. It's weird, at least to my non-expert eye on terrorism. That first off, these guys, Doku Umarov, who's the head of the organization of the Caucasus Emirates, they're responsible for some of the worst terrorist attacks we're all familiar with. There was school hostage-taking crisis, theater sieges where hundreds were killed, Moscow metro by the Black Widows, women bombers.
Which makes it funny that he's now saying that he's going to allow innocent casualties.
It is, but this is my question then. Why not take credit? No one's taking credit for any of these bombings. These are some high-profile terrorists.
Keep them guessing. Keep them guessing. If they were to take credit now, then it's kind of like they're waiting for the final act, I think, before they take credit.
Do you anticipate that there are certain people that Russian and even American security forces are aware of that are plotting right now, but they are waiting to make arrests up until like the last week before the Olympics, so that there's no time around that they have to sort of like reset up an attack?
That's possible, but I think in a situation like this, you're going to want to make it as secure as possible, as early as possible. So if they had any real suspects, especially with the Russians involved, I think Putin would come down with that heavy sledgehammer on them as soon as possible.
All right, Tim. Thanks for joining us at our new
table.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
All right.